Samantha ran through the dark forest, her phone trembling in her hand, its flashlight flickering across the dense, threatening trees. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she could hear Brian's shouts echoing from the campsite. They weren't calls for help anymore. They were screams, angry, desperate, and filled with pain. Behind her, she could make out Aiden's cursing, his footsteps pounding the damp forest floor as he chased Brian through the camp. Samantha kept moving, documenting everything even as the reality of the situation dawned on her. This wasn't just another adventure to capture. This was a tragedy, and she was right at the center of it. It hadn't started that way. Rewind 2 days, and everything had seemed almost perfect. The kind of untouched wilderness experience that Samantha, a popular travel blogger, had always bragged about to her hundreds of thousands of followers. The secluded campsite, shared on social media, was supposed to be one of her riskiest and most authentic camping trips yet. And why not? Her reputation thrived on daring challenges and picturesque shots of her untamed lifestyle. Samantha was known for her vivid descriptions of hidden locations, often painted as idyllic scenes of solitude and beauty, a wild nature untarnished by human interference. Her brand thrived on stories where she played the hero, confronting and triumphing over the elements, always brushing against danger. For her followers, she was brave and unyielding. But for Brian, her longtime friend and an experienced survivalist, who had often played her partner in these expeditions, Samantha was reckless, naive, and careless. Brian was her polar opposite, practical, methodical, and forever in Samantha's shadow. He had spent years studying the land, understanding how nature worked. Where Samantha relied on dramatic improvisation for her viral content, Brian relied on preparation, experience, and careful planning. He had followed her to this new campsite, agreeing to be part of her wild adventure, but beneath his steady exterior lay a growing frustration. It gnawed at him whenever Samantha broke a simple safety rule for a photo op, or ignored his advice just for the thrill. The jealousy festered inside Brian, jealousy not only of Samantha's popularity, but of her unflinching disregard for what he considered the basics of outdoor survival. She had turned it all into a game, something Brian found insulting. And so a twisted plan began to form in his mind. It was a childish idea, one born out of ego and the hope that he might finally make Samantha understand the importance of the rules she so casually dismissed. Brian decided he would teach her a lesson, something harmless but unsettling. He started taking small portions of their food supply, enough to make her think twice about being careless with their rations, but not enough to cause real harm. He did it without thinking too deeply, convinced that Samantha, given her tendency to jump to conclusions, would merely brush it off as bad luck or animal interference. Then Aiden arrived. Aiden was a local, someone with a reputation. People in the nearby town knew him for his small-time thefts. Never anything major, just a desperate man making ends meet in the only way he knew how. When he saw Samantha and Brian arriving at the campsite, he thought it might be a good opportunity. He watched them from a distance, noticing their expensive camping gear, Samantha's phone always pointed toward her face or capturing the scenery. Aiden figured he might be able to sneak in and grab something valuable while they were distracted. On the second night, Samantha noticed that food was missing. She was furious. Her frustration bubbled over when she saw Aiden, a stranger, watching them from the tree line that day. It fit her narrative perfectly. Here was some creep who had probably been sneaking around, taking what didn't belong to him. She pointed it out to Brian, but he dismissed her complaints, saying that she was too quick to judge. The tension between Samantha and Brian escalated. He knew he was behind the missing supplies, but he wasn't willing to admit it. He watched her turn Aiden into the villain of their story. She even went as far as recording him, telling her followers how unsafe she felt and how important it was to be cautious while camping. Her flair for drama disgusted Brian. He wanted her to learn her lesson, but instead, she was using this as more content for her page, making herself the star once again, while he looked like the passive friend unwilling to protect her. Aiden, meanwhile, had no idea that Samantha had noticed him, or that she was blaming him for her missing food. He had waited for his moment, and on that second night, As Brian's plan continued to unfold, Aiden decided to make his move, only he ended up witnessing something far more confusing. He watched as Brian, under the cover of darkness, moved to the food supply and took even more. Aiden thought he was watching some bizarre, deceitful game, and it convinced him that Brian and Samantha were not who they appeared to be. In the early morning, things spiraled out of control. Aiden confronted Brian just as Samantha was off in the woods, filming her morning segment. Brian tried to brush him off, but Aiden was insistent. He demanded to know what Brian was doing, why he was hiding food, and what kind of trick they were trying to pull on him. Brian's patience snapped, and the argument turned physical. Aiden, seeing Brian's aggression, pulled out the knife he carried for protection. In his eyes, he was defending himself from whatever strange game these campers were playing. By the time Samantha heard the noise and made it back to the campsite, she saw Brian on the ground, bleeding, and Aiden standing over him, wild-eyed and terrified. Samantha did what she always did. She turned on her phone and started filming, capturing the chaos as it unfolded, too shocked to think of anything else. She screamed at Aiden, backing away as he tried to explain, tried to make her understand that he wasn't the villain she thought he was. But Samantha's fear was real, and she ran. Now, as she stumbled through the forest, desperate to get away, she realized that this was not some dramatic adventure for her blog. It wasn't a story she could control or a narrative she could spin for her audience. Her pursuit of drama, Brian's resentment, Aiden's desperation, it had all led to this point. As Samantha emerged from the forest onto a road, she flagged down a passing car, her face pale and her hands shaking. She managed to call for help, but by then, it was too late for Brian. Aiden had panicked and fled, leaving Brian alone in the dirt. The lesson Brian had planned had spiraled into something darker than he ever intended, a brutal consequence of his jealousy and Samantha's endless hunger for attention. Samantha uploaded the footage later, but it wasn't with the thrill she'd expected. Her followers saw the fear, the confusion, and the regret in her eyes. She realized then the cost of living her life for an audience. It was more than just likes and shares. It was a responsibility to the people she involved in her stories, the friends she dragged into her dangerous games. Story 2. The cold night air wrapped around Jake as he stood motionless, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. His eyes bore into Carl, whose eager expression seemed out of place amid the chaos and fear surrounding them. Ben's breathing came in ragged gasps, his face smeared with tears and mud, his eyes darting wildly from Carl to Jake. "Where is Lily, Ben?" Jake demanded, his voice barely holding onto its usual sternness. Ben shook his head frantically, repeating, Something out there took her." Carl stepped forward, his eyes glinting under the pale moonlight, and said calmly, "We need to find whatever's out there, Jake. We can't let this happen again. We need to protect them." Jake took a step back, his mind reeling. Something didn't add up. Carl's insistence, his eerie composure while Ben was unraveling, the overturned campsite, the blood trailing deeper into the woods, and Carl's almost too perfect timing. It was all leading to a terrible realization that made Jake's gut twist. "Carl, step away from Ben," Jake said, his voice now laden with suspicion. Carl's face fell, his cheerful demeanor giving way to something darker. He frowned, taking a slow step closer to Ben, ignoring Jake's warning. Jake's heart pounded as Carl glanced back at him with a strange, almost pitying smile. It was then that Jake realized what had been happening all along. Carl was not the overeager, well-meaning volunteer he pretended to be. He had orchestrated this. Earlier that day, the forest had been calm. The dense canopy above allowed only streaks of sunlight to pierce through, creating dancing patterns on the forest floor. Jake, a seasoned park ranger, had walked the paths with purpose. He had spent years patrolling these woods, especially since his divorce had left him with nothing but his work. The forest had become his sanctuary, the place where he could drown his regrets in the rhythm of nature. The rustling leaves, the distant chirps of birds, and the ever-changing paths he knew better than anyone. Jake had met Lily and Ben at one of the designated campsites. Lily had smiled politely, her eyes betraying a hint of nervousness, while Ben had barely hidden his irritation at Jake's strict instructions. "Stick to the marked paths. The woods can be dangerous if you stray," Jake had warned, his voice carrying authority. Ben had rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath about overzealous rangers. Jake had tried to ignore Ben's attitude. He'd seen it before. Young campers with no respect for nature's unpredictability. But something about Ben's dismissiveness had nagged at him as he walked away, as if it were an omen of what was to come. Carl, the new volunteer ranger, had tagged along with Jake throughout the day. He was enthusiastic, almost to the point of annoyance, always asking questions, always trying to do more than what was needed. Jake had found his eagerness a little overwhelming, but Carl reminded him of his younger self, determined to prove his worth. And after all, it was good to have help. Since his personal life had fallen apart, Jake had found comfort in the idea of training someone to share his responsibilities, to not always feel so alone. As night fell, Carl had mentioned that he hadn't seen Lily and Ben's tent when he did his evening rounds. Jake's instincts kicked in. He knew something was wrong. They had rushed to the site, only to find the campsite empty, tent torn, gear scattered, and splashes of blood leading away from the marked area. Jake's heart sank, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a pang of fear he couldn't quite shake. Carl's insistence to go after whatever did this had seemed natural at first, but as they trudged deeper into the woods, Jake began to notice things that didn't sit right. Carl seemed to know exactly where to go, leading the way with a confidence that should have been impossible. He moved with purpose, almost as if he were following a predetermined path rather than searching. The realization gnawed at Jake, and then they found Ben, alone, panicked, his clothes torn, and his face a mask of fear. Back in the present, Jake's mind snapped back to the immediate danger. Carl's eyes were now filled with a mix of anger and something else, something possessive, something desperate. "They never listen, Jake. None of them do," Carl said, his voice steady but cold. "I've watched you. You try so hard to keep them safe, but they don't respect you. They don't understand what it takes to keep order in a place like this." Jake swallowed, his eyes locked on Carl. "What did you do, Carl?" Carl smiled, a twisted, almost sympathetic expression. "I showed them, Jake. I showed them what happens when they don't listen, when they don't respect the forest. I wanted to help you, to make them see that you're not just some divorced guy wasting away out here. You're a protector. And me?" He gestured around them. "I'm your proof." The words hung in the air, each one heavier than the last. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. He had been so focused on keeping everything under control, the campers, his emotions, the forest, that he hadn't seen what was right in front of him. Carl hadn't wanted to help. He wanted to replace him, to become the hero of his own twisted story. Ben whimpered, stepping back as Carl took another step toward him. Jake knew he had to act. He couldn't let Carl hurt anyone else. In one swift motion, Jake lunged, grabbing Carl's arm and twisting it behind his back. Carl struggled, but Jake held firm, his voice a low growl. "You're done, Carl. You hear me? This ends now." Carl laughed, the sound devoid of any humor. "You still don't get it, Jake. It's not about ending. It's about proving a point." In the aftermath, the authorities arrived, and Carl was taken away, his eyes never leaving Jake's. There was no remorse, only a twisted satisfaction that made Jake's skin crawl. As Carl was driven away, Jake stood by Ben, who was still shaking, his eyes vacant. Jake knew that the forest had changed for him. It wasn't just a place of solace anymore. It was a place where he had almost lost himself, where his need for control had blinded him to the danger that had been right beside him all along. He watched as the ambulance took Ben away, his thoughts heavy. He had prided himself on being a protector, on keeping people safe, but he had failed to see the danger in his own ranks. And now, as the forest loomed around him, dark and indifferent, Jake realized that sometimes the real threat wasn't the wilderness. It was the people who walked within it. Story 3. Nick's fists clenched, his knuckles white against the dimming light of the campsite as he approached Old Bill's shack. His heart pounded with anger and fear, feeling as though his chest would burst. The crumbling wooden structure looked abandoned from a distance, but there was a flicker of a dim lantern light in the window. That flicker gave Nick a sense of both hope and dread. Somewhere in there was Tyler. He was sure of it. Nick could feel his muscles tense as he caught sight of Old Bill moving inside the shack, his silhouette hunched, busy with something near the firewood pile. Nick charged ahead, his military instincts kicking in. He didn't call out, not at first. He moved silently, the way he'd been trained to. The forest around him was deathly quiet, only the crackling of Bill's firewood fire echoing through the cold air. Then Nick saw it. The unmistakable fabric of Tyler's red jacket half buried in the pile of wood. The dread in Nick's gut hardened into rage. "Bill!" Nick bellowed, the command echoing like a shot. The old man jerked around, his wide eyes startled. His grizzled face twisted into something akin to confusion as he turned to face Nick. "Where is he? Where's my son?" Nick roared, storming closer. Old Bill held his hands up defensively, but Nick was beyond reasoning. He grabbed Bill by the collar, his mind flooded with images of his teenage son alone, frightened, or worse. Nick's grip tightened, shaking Bill until the man gasped, but the old hermit's voice came out calm. "Ain't touched nobody. You got it all wrong," Bill rasped, his voice carrying the crackle of someone who'd smoked too much for far too long. Rewind to just 2 days earlier, when Nick and Tyler had arrived at the campsite. It had been Nick's idea to come up here. He wanted to reconnect with his son, to take a break from the technology that seemed to dominate Tyler's life. Tyler, all 16 years of him, had protested the trip, rolling his eyes in the way only teenagers can, but Nick had insisted. He missed Tyler. He missed the closeness they once had, before life got complicated and Tyler's focus shifted from family to friends and his phone. Nick was a former soldier. Discipline and preparation were part of his DNA. He wanted Tyler to learn to appreciate nature, to understand survival, and perhaps even to see his old man as something other than the out-of-touch strict father Tyler seemed to think he was. The first day had gone well enough. Tyler grudgingly helped set up the tent while Nick did his best to make it fun, to bridge the gap between them. But the tension was still there, the underlying resentment Tyler held for being dragged away from his world. Then there was Old Bill. Nick had heard about Bill from the locals at the nearby town. A hermit living off the land, collecting firewood from the surrounding forests. They said he wasn't dangerous, just a bit odd. But when Bill showed up at their campsite uninvited, Tyler couldn't help but mock Nick's wariness. "Seriously, Dad? It's just some old guy. What's he gonna do? Beat us with a stick?" Tyler had laughed. Nick, though, didn't like the way Bill lingered near their site, staring a little too long at their gear, speaking in cryptic phrases about his mountain and trespassers. Nick had waved him off, but the sense of unease lingered. The breaking point came on the second night. Father and son had argued, a real fight. Tyler, tired of Nick's lectures about safety and respect, had thrown down his flashlight and stormed off into the woods. Nick had thought Tyler just needed to blow off steam and would be back in a few minutes. But as minutes turned into an hour, and then 2, Nick's frustration shifted into fear. He went looking, shouting Tyler's name into the growing darkness, his flashlight beam bouncing between trees. He had been walking in circles, calling out, when he noticed something, movement in the distance, near Old Bill's shack. The old man had kept to the fringes of the camp earlier, watching, and now here he was again, his silhouette visible against the flicker of a lantern. And then, the red jacket, Tyler's jacket, peeking out from beneath Bill's firewood pile. Rage overtook every rational thought Nick had. He was sure Old Bill had done something to Tyler. He charged forward, fists clenched, ready to do whatever it took to find his son. But Old Bill, though startled, had stood his ground. "You're wrong," he kept saying. "Ain't touched the boy." His voice, though raspy and trembling, held a kind of truth Nick wasn't ready to hear. The two men stood there, Nick's hand on Bill's collar, ready to escalate, when a new voice broke through the tension. Dad, stop! Nick spun, his eyes widening as Tyler emerged from the tree line, his face flushed with embarrassment. He was dirty, his jeans streaked with mud, and his expression was a mix of shame and frustration. I'm fine. I slipped, okay? I slipped into the creek and got lost trying to find my way back, Tyler said, his voice breaking with the weight of everything unsaid between them. The anger, the misunderstanding, the fear. Nick released Bill, stepping back, his mind spinning. All the anger, the worry, the fear. It had twisted his perception, made him see danger where there was none. Old Bill, this old man living alone in the woods, had only been trying to help. He had seen Tyler wandering, lost, and had gone to gather things to help lead him back. Bill rubbed his neck, wincing slightly as he looked between Nick and Tyler. Told ya. Ain't touched nobody, he said, his voice gruff but without malice. Nick's face flushed with shame. He had let his instincts, his fear for his son's safety, blind him to what was really happening. He had jumped to conclusions, let his distrust cloud his judgment, and almost hurt an innocent man because of it. Tyler looked at his father, the tension between them now mixed with something else, understanding. Nick took a shaky breath, turning fully toward Bill. I'm sorry, he said, his voice low. I was just scared for him. Old Bill nodded slowly, his expression softening. Reckon I'd be the same, were it my boy, he said before turning back to his shack without another word, leaving Nick and Tyler alone in the clearing. Father and son stood there, the forest around them silent, but no longer threatening. Nick reached out, placing a hand on Tyler's shoulder. Let's get back to camp, he said quietly. As they walked back, Tyler glanced at his father. You don't have to be the soldier all the time, you know, he said, his voice soft, almost forgiving. Nick nodded, his throat tight. He realized then that this trip was never about survival skills or reconnecting through some forced experience. It was about trust that he had lost somewhere along the line, both in himself and in his son, and now perhaps they could start to rebuild it, one step at a time.